Hello everyone, tonight let us lie down together in a forgotten time, when the nights were long and the gods were always near. Imagine the soft creak of a bed made of woven straw, pushed into the corner of a damp hut. The wood creaks under the weight of fatigue. Outside, the wind scratches the thatch roof, like fingers eager to enter. Inside, all is silent, except for the rhythmic sound of a woman's breathing in labor. Medieval life was simple, but never light. The mud walls did not keep out the cold, nor the whispers of anguished prayers. With each contraction, a promise was made to the saints, to the Virgin, to the unknown. Birth was as much a moment of faith as of fear, and on that rough mattress, more than a baby, a destiny was also born. The woman lying there did not know the name of the anatomy that was causing her pain, nor the terms to describe the fever that would come later. But she knew the midwife's gaze. That gaze carried centuries of intuition, of loss, of silence. The straw bed was the stage, the altar, and the battlefield. The muffled sound of the hay pressing under the body was part of the ritual. It was there, in that cramped space, that the fate of two souls was decided, the one coming into the world, and the one that was perhaps about to leave it. The pressure of the gods did not come with thunder. It arrived with murmured prayers, consumed candles, and trembling hands holding reliquary. There were no scalpels, no anesthesia, just the smell of dry straw mixed with the acid sweat of pain. Women, from a very young age, learned to associate blood not only with life, but also with judgment. If the baby didn't cry, it was because something had been done wrong, or worse, because something had been hidden. Sometimes the straw bed became a deathbed, and when that happened, a candle was lit not to provide light, but to indicate that someone had passed away. Shadows danced on the wall as if in silent mourning. The midwife's words, when they came softly, as if they spoke more to the saints than to the people. In those days, fertility was both a blessing and a punishment. Each child could be a gift, or a sentence, and that bed, the same one used for love and sleep, became the place where a woman's worth was tested. There were no witnesses, only neighbors who came to help, but helping was also about observing. And observing, sometimes, was about judging. The fear of failure was as physical as the pain. A woman could leave that bed with a baby in her arms and a soul in pieces, or not at all. The straw would remain there one day dry, the next day stained, and life went on without fanfare, without mercy. The gods, they said, watched everything, but they didn't speak. So all that was left was to believe in signs. A strong baby was seen as divine approval, a weak cry as a warning. And if something happened to the newborn, it was common for the blame to fall on the woman. Maybe she had sinned. Maybe she hadn't prayed enough. Or maybe she had been touched by some ancient curse. The straw bed, in this context, was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a witness. It was a confidant. It was a court. And every woman who lay on it knew it, even if she had never heard such words. Looking back now, it's hard to imagine a world where pain was experienced so alone. But back then, silence was the norm. And even when there were screams, they were muffled not by the fear of feeling, but by the fear of being heard. Faith was the only relief, and also the only consolation when everything went wrong. Between each straw, an old sigh still seems trapped, as if the walls held the echoes of all those nights. Those nights when fate depended more on luck and faith than on medicine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you want, share in the comments where you're listening to me from right now, and what time it is there. I love imagining this invisible map that connects us through time and sleep. Now, turn off the lights, maybe light a candle just to set the mood, and let the whispers of the story lull your night. It was night when it all began. The sky, dark as a morning veil, hung over the village as if waiting. The woman had been bent over for hours, her hands clasped tightly to the frayed fabric of the mattress. Each contraction was a whisper between her body and the divine. She didn't scream, not because she didn't want to, but because she was afraid of who would hear. Childbirth, at that time, was not seen as a miracle. It was a test of faith, of purity, of worthiness. Before any movement, prayers came, words recited with the same cadence of fear. The midwife made the sign of the cross on the belly, and the sheets were already beginning to bear the color of the life that was being broken. The sheets, washed in the Sundays before, had not remained white for long. The scarlet stain had begun to spread even before the baby showed any sign of arrival. And yet, it was considered natural. There was no alarm, only eyes that stared at each other in silence. The woman was sweating. Her face glowed as if she were feverish. But there was no fresh water. There was no rest. There was faith, and a candle flickering on the wood beside the bed. In every prayer, a hope. In every drop of blood, a reminder that life was a chance, not a right. Some women closed their eyes and whispered promises to the Virgin Mary. Promises of name, of sacrifice, of fasting. In the background, the sound of the night continued as if nothing was happening. A dog barked in the distance. The wind passed through the cracks in the window with the smell of damp wood. Inside the house, everything was suspended. It was impossible to know whether it was a birth or a farewell. The midwife, with calloused hands and sunken eyes, played carefully. Her words were few, but her actions were precise. Each gesture had been learned from the pain of others. She could not read, but she knew how to listen to the sounds of the body. She knew when pain was good and when it was dangerous, and that made her more feared than the priest, more sought after than the doctor. Around the bed, some women watched in silence. They were neighbors, sisters, aunts. They knew that at that moment the world was limited to that room, to that ragged breath, to the invisible thread between now and then. No one thought about the future. All they thought about was surviving the next contraction. There were prayers, many. Some improvised, others inherited, repeated like mantras, almost in a trance. That was how they tried to ward off evil spirits. That was how they tried to convince the heavens that that soul deserved to live. The words didn't need to make sense. They just needed to keep fear at bay. When the baby finally began to announce itself, there were no cries of relief. There was tension, the sound of the liquid dripping, the tear in the fabric, the woman's moan. And then, the silence, the pause, the moment when everything seemed suspended. Would the baby come breathing, crying, silent? The answer defined what would come next. The sheet, now wet and dark, was folded carefully, not to be washed, but to be hidden. Too much blood could generate suspicion, too little distrust. Everything was measured with ancient eyes. Nothing escaped the judgment of the neighbors. Not sweat, not pain, not hope. In the absence of doctors or diagnoses, everything was attributed to divine will. If the baby survived, it was a miracle. If not, it was a punishment, and no one dared to question it. It was easier to accept the hand of heaven than to admit human frailty. That is why each birth was preceded by prayers, not out of faith alone, but out of fear, a deep ancestral fear, a fear that came from deep within the earth, from the depths of the soul, from all the women who had bled before. Pain was nothing new. It was an inheritance, and each stained sheet was another chapter in that ancient story. When everything was over, whether life or death, the candle was slowly extinguished. No one spoke loudly. No one celebrated. There was always a silence hanging over her, like a smoke screen. The exhausted woman was covered with another cloth. The baby, if it was breathing, was wrapped in a dry cloth and placed in her arms. But even so, no one smiled. It was still early. It was still dangerous. The prayers continued, even in their thoughts, because the night was not over yet. And in that village, between prayers and stained sheets, tomorrow was always a mystery. There was a strange wisdom in the midwife's hands, a wisdom that did not come from books, but from silences, long, heavy silences. Between one breath and the next, the blood, when it flowed, was rarely commented on. It simply existed as an inevitable part of that moment. But there were differences. A bright red was expected, but when it darkened too quickly, when it came with a pungent smell, the midwife knew. She knew, but she did not say, because saying, in those days, could mean condemning not only the woman, but herself. So she kept quiet. She cleaned what she could. She hid what should not be seen, and she left the rest for the gods to decide. Sometimes she would put extra cloths under the bed, not for hygiene, but for disguise. Too much blood could arouse suspicion, and there was always someone nearby ready to suspect. If the woman died, the priest would ask if there had been sin. If the baby did not survive, the husband would ask if there had been witchcraft. The midwife stood in the middle, between the natural and the supernatural, between the body and the myth, and her silence was her only protection. She carried the weight of the choice to remain silent, because speaking was dangerous. To speak was to betray. To speak could be her last word. She knew when a placenta didn't come. She knew when the blood was too slow or too fast, but she couldn't tell. Many times, she would just hold the woman's hand. She would tell her that it would pass, that it was normal, that everything was, even when it wasn't, even when the woman's gaze had already wandered. Because in that society, admitting a mistake was admitting guilt, and guilt for a woman was a sentence. That's why she hid it. She would sew the sheets later. She would wash them herself, when she could. She would bury cloths. She would cover up her tracks, and she would move on to the next call as if nothing had happened. There were nights when she would leave a house and cry alone on the way, but not on the outside, on the inside. Each loss was an invisible scar. Each life that slipped through her fingers left a new silence. She was not a saint, but she was not a witch either. She was human, and too human to live without feeling. But she learned. She learned to hide even her own feeling. She learned to breathe deeply in the face of fear, to repeat mechanical prayers while blood stained the ground, because that was what the world demanded of her. To be strong, to be mute, to be invisible. Complications, when they came, were seen as trials or punishment, never as something that could be predicted or treated. There were no tests, no consultations, just faith, and sometimes this faith hurt, because it was accompanied by loneliness. The woman in labor didn't know what her body was hiding, and the midwife, even knowing, couldn't tell. It was a silent pact, a cruel theater, in which pain was the scenery and hope the costume. Everything had to seem under control, even when death was already looming, even when the smell of blood announced the worst. And so the blood flowed silently. It ran through the sheets, through the straw, through the dirt floor. It was cleaned with cold water and a thick cloth, and then forgotten, at least on the outside, because on the inside it remained. It remained in the eyes of the midwife, in the memory of the woman who survived, on the walls of the house that saw it all. And no one spoke, because speaking was opening a wound. It was exposing what everyone would rather not know. Silence was better. Prayer was better. Pretending that everything worked out, even when the baby never cried, even when the candle was blown out too soon. Today, looking back, we can wonder how many lives were saved by these silences, and how many were lost. We may never know, but there is something sacred in this ignorance, an involuntary respect for that which could not be said, and perhaps also a warning that not all wisdom needs to be spoken. Some lives only in the look, in the touch, in the moment when the midwife decides what to show and what to keep. The men's eyes weighed more than the birth itself. They were not present during the birth, but they were present for everything that came after. They did not see the blood. They did not hear the screams. They did not feel the stifling heat of the straw. But they judged. They judged based on what was left, a healthy baby or not, a living woman or not, a rumor that spread through the village. The woman who had just bled her soul was looked at as if she carried secrets, and the midwife as if she had provoked them, because for many men of the time, the unknown was frightening, and everything that involved the female body was unknown. There were priests who preferred not to hear stories of childbirth. It was dirty, they said. It was impure. But they were the same ones who demanded immediate baptism, as if a baby's soul needed to be washed before it could breathe legitimately. The exhausted woman could barely keep her eyes open, but she was placed under the gaze of the priest, her husband, the village. It was as if, after giving birth, she also needed to justify her conduct. Was she faithful? Was the child really her husband's? Did she have help from some dark force to survive? These questions were not spoken, but they were in the eyes. The midwife carried the greatest burden, because she knew too much. She knew when the baby did not have the father's features. She knew when the woman begged for herbs before the pregnancy took hold. She knew when the birth had been too long, too bloody, to risk it. But she said nothing. And yet, she was suspect. She was a woman. She was old. She was wise. 3 sins for a society that preferred ignorance to autonomy. If the birth ended in death, she was guilty. If it ended in life, the merit went to heaven. She was always between the knife and the altar, never at peace. Sometimes a man would show up at the house days after the birth. He wanted to talk to the midwife, but it wasn't out of gratitude. It was to probe, was the baby born well? Did the woman say anything strange? Were there different prayers? The questions were asked with forced lightness, but the tone was dry, cutting. She answered carefully, each word measured like a drop of blood. She knew that a verbal slip could turn into a denunciation, and a denunciation could turn into a bonfire. The man's gaze wasn't just a judgment. It was a threat, a constant present, even in his absence. So the midwife learned early on to look away, to keep her shoulders hunched, to say little. It was a kind of strategic invisibility, to be there without being noticed, to do her job without raising any dust. But it didn't always work. Sometimes all it took was a rumor, a sick child, a baby who didn't cry, a midnight birth, and that was it. She was called a witch. She was taken to church. She was questioned by men who had never held a woman in labor, who had never smelled fear or felt the heat of blood. But they judged, as if they knew. And yet, when pain knocked on the door, she was the one they called. In the early hours of the morning, with hurried steps, someone would knock and say it was urgent, that a woman was bleeding, that she needed help, that only she knew what to do. And she went, even though she knew that the next day she might be accused again. It was a cycle of need and contempt, a constant paradox, being essential and being avoided. being sought after and being feared, being needed and being disposable. Men's judgment did not need evidence. The discomfort with what they did not understand was enough. The male gaze at that time was more than social. It was spiritual. It was political. It was a daily reminder that for a woman knowledge was dangerous, and for a midwife it could be fatal. Yet they kept going. They kept looking at the floor, listening carefully, caring gently, because they knew that true judgment did not come from men. It came from the silence of the early morning, from the baby's breathing, from the woman's sigh, from the candle flickering in the corner of the room. And in this invisible court, justice was different. It was made of compassion, not condemnation. There was a specific smell, hard to describe, that filled the house as labor approached. It was a mixture of light smoke from the fireplace, vinegar spread on racks to ward off evil spirit, hot sweat beading on the woman's skin, and dried herbs burning in a corner. Each scent had a purpose, but together they formed a dense cloud, charged with anxiety, faith, and an ancient kind of hope. The air felt thick, as if every particle were made of prayer. Even those who didn't know what was happening knew when they crossed the threshold. They knew it by smell. Vinegar was always the first. It was spread on the floor, on cloths, sometimes on hands. They said it purified, that it warded off illnesses, evil spirits, envious eyes. The midwife knew that vinegar did not cure infections, but she also knew that belief was as important as care. And so she poured it, in circles, as if creating an invisible barrier between the pain and the outside world. The acidic smell permeated the walls. It stayed in the hair, on the clothes, on the sheets. It was a scent that left its mark. That said, here, life is about to begin, or end. Then came the smoke. It wasn't always intentional. Sometimes it was from damp wood, other times from a candle about to go out. But there was also smoke made on purpose. Leaves, roots, flowers were burned, not for the scent, but for the ritual. Some believed that the smoke carried prayers to the heaven, others that it camouflaged the smells of death, should it come. The fact is that the environment changed. The house stopped being a common shelter and became an improvised sanctuary. The smoke danced across the ceiling as if it knew the secrets that were being lived there. Sweat was inevitable. It ran down the woman's temples. It marked her neck, her back. It was a thick sweat, the result of effort and fear. It smelled of salt and struggle, and it mixed with the aroma of old cloth, of wet wood, of the earth that entered through the cracks. The delivery room was not clean in the modern sense, but it was prepared, with stretched cloths, basins of heated water, worn pillows that had seen other nights like that. And sweat was part of that. It was the living mark of the moment. It was the body's response to everything the soul was trying to endure. The herbs also left their trail. Some were crushed and placed under the bed. Others were burned. Still others were boiled and given as an infusion. There was chamomile, rue, rosemary, sage. Each had its role. Some calmed, others caused contraction, others protected. At least that was what was believed. And the smell of these herbs filled the corners of the house, like a kind of silent chant. A warning to the gods, a reminder to the men, a consolation to the women. The midwife, even without knowing how to read, knew the names. She knew the times. She knew the effects. And she knew that the smell was part of the ritual. Together, these smells created an atmosphere that did not easily dissipate. Even days later, the house still bore traces of what had happened. A forgotten cloth in the corner, an open jar of vinegar, a dry twig on the floor, and that smell. A smell that said, here, someone had crossed a threshold, and that was sacred. For those who lived there, that smell could be uncomfortable. But for those who understood, it was a reminder, a trace of courage, a shadow of the presence of life and death. Today, when we talk about childbirth, we think of bright, clean, fragrant rooms. But back then, the smell was different. It was dense. It was real. It was part of the experience. It was like another character in that story. An invisible but present character, who accompanied the unfolding of each contraction, who infiltrated clothes, memories, dreams, and even without being seen, it was felt deeply. Like everything that is essential. The midwife's hands didn't come from a school. They didn't have diplomas or certificates. They learned from other people's bodies. And before that, they learned from their own. It was at the first menstruation, at the first strange touch, at the first pain that had no name. These hands grew along with the woman. And one day, almost without warning, they were called to hold, to clean, to guide one life out of another. That was how one learned. Not with theory, but with hard, humid, sweaty practice of necessity. And once they touched the womb in labor, these hands were never the same again. There was no time for doubt, no room for hesitation. The woman was there, screaming or whispering, her eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling, and the midwife knew that this moment was unique, irreversible. Whatever she did or didn't do would mark to lifetime. 3 sometimes. That's why her hands learned quickly, and they learned in a way that was unforgettable. They learned to distinguish the weight of the baby before seeing it. They learned to recognize the cold skin of an imminent hemorrhage. They learned the sound of bones giving way, and all of this alone. In the dark, in the silence, in fear. Sometimes another older woman would accompany her. Someone who also knew, who had seen it before, who gave advice in short sentence. Between one contraction and the next, there were no debates. There were calm statements, said as if they were ancient prayers. Now, turn, lower your head. The hands obeyed. And so knowledge was passed on, not through traditional teaching, but through ancestral repetition. It was a legacy made of gestures, of looks, of instinct, and of listening deeply to the other's body. The body that bled, that trembled, that begged, that trusted. What we now call anatomy, they called feeling. They felt the baby's position by the rigidity of the belly. They felt the dilation by the temperature of the touch. They felt the risk by the tone of the cry. And so, their hands became eyes, sentinels, oracles. Because many times, the eyes could not see what was happening. It was necessary to feel. It was necessary to intuit. It was necessary to act without being sure. And even so, to get it right. Not by luck, but by organic learning. Learning that emerged from practice, from mistakes, from crying, from life. And when it was all over, those tired hands would clean the baby, cover the mother, arrange the cloths. Then they would retire. They would go back to rest. But they did not truly rest, because they knew they would be called again. Maybe that very night, maybe in another village. And even without rest, they would go, because the knowledge they carried was not for themselves. It was for the other. It was for the next woman who screamed, for the next baby who cried, for the next womb that would break like the earth at harvest. There were times when their hands would shake, especially at the beginning, but they couldn't show it. The midwife knew that the security she conveyed was part of the treatment. If their hands shook, their fear would increase. And fear, at that time, was a slow poison. That's why they also learned to disguise it, to steady their fingers, warming their palms, touching with presence, with firmness, with the full certainty that everything was under control, even when the world seemed about to collapse. Because there, in that dark house, the touch was stronger than any words. Today, when we think of doctors, we imagine lab coats, lights, and equipment. But back then, all it took was their hands. 2 calloused, experienced, silent hands. Hands that had no voice, but had memory. Hands that, even when alone, knew what to do. And that went on, night after night, carrying with them a knowledge that could not fit into books, but that fit perfectly between the belly and the heart. The night carried a different weight when a woman went into labor. During the day, there was the comfort of light, the movement of the village, the sound of chickens, ox carts, and children running. But at night, everything was suspended. Silence took over the houses. And when someone knocked on the midwife's door under the cover of darkness of dawn, her heart knew. It was not good news. It was an urgency shrouded in omens. It was the cursed hour, the hour when the gods slept, and the demons awoke. Night births were feared, not because the pain was greater, but because the loneliness was absolute. There was no one to help. There was no one to bring more firewood. There was no curious neighbor to watch with attentive eyes. There was only the woman in her bed, the midwife kneeling on the floor, and the moon outside as an indifferent witness. The wind whistled through the cracks in the door, and each noise seemed like a warning. Sometimes the candle would tremble for no apparent reason. Sometimes the water in the basin would cool too quickly. Everything was a sign. Everything was fear. Births that took place between midnight and dawn were surrounded by legend. They said that if the baby was born at exactly 3 o'clock, something from the other world would accompany it. They said that nocturnal children were more sensitive, more restless, closer to the mist. There was no basis for such beliefs, but there was also no way to refute them, because, many times, they were confirmed. A baby who cried to a mother who did not wake up, a birth without visible complication, but with a dark outcome. The night had its mysteries, and no one wanted to challenge what they did not understand. The midwife, in these moments, became more than a caregiver. She was a guardian. She was a bridge between worlds. She protected not only the woman's body, but also her soul. She whispered prayers that were not in the church books, words that came from forgotten grandmothers. She prayed quietly, while arranging the cloths. She placed rue leaves behind the door. She tied ribbons to the woman's wrists, not out of superstition, but out of love, out of fear, out of care, because at that moment, Any help was welcome, even the help that could not be seen. The pain in the darkness was deeper. There was no distraction. There was no leakage. Each contraction was amplified by the echo of silence. The woman clung to her sheets as if holding on to the edge of an abyss. She cried without knowing if it was out of fear or relief, and the midwife held her hand tightly, as if to say, "I'm here," even though she didn't say anything, because at that moment words were no use. What sustained life was touch, warmth, presence, and the hope that the sun would soon rise. Sometimes, when the labor went on too long, the candle would burn out, and there was no other. The midwife would then use the light from the ember, a flickering orange glow that made everything even darker. It was as if they were in the womb of the world, surrounded by darkness, but resisting. And when the baby finally came, it was as if a ray of light tore through the darkness, a fragile but lively cry, a sound that broke the curse of the night, even if only for a short time, because until the mother was out of danger, the dawn could still bring its shadows. And even after everything, the fear remained. The midwife walked home with slow steps. The ground was still damp from the frost. Her eyes were heavy, not only from tiredness, but from fear. He knew he had won yet another battle, but he also knew that another would come, that the next dawn might be even darker. And yet, he would carry on, because that was what he did, because that was what he was. Guardian of life in the darkest hours, witness to the silent courage of women, and confidant of the night, who never revealed all its secrets. It wasn't always the body that was at risk. Sometimes it was the soul. In those days, it was believed that a baby needed to be baptized as soon as possible, preferably in the first moments of life, because if you died before that, the soul would be left on the sideline, without a name, without rest, without heaven. And this responsibility often fell to the midwife. She wasn't just the one who gave birth. She was also the one who could guarantee access to eternity. And that was a difficult burden to bear. One miscalculation, one delay in touching, 1 second indecision, and a baby's soul could be lost forever. When the birth was difficult and the baby did not breathe right away, the midwife knew what to do. She had learned to repeat sacred words in a low but firm voice. She would pour a trickle of water, even if it was from a basin, even if it was lukewarm, even if there was no priest near, and she would say the name, any name, a name that, at that moment, was enough. It didn't matter if it was pretty, or if it was desired. What mattered was that it existed, because the name was the passport of the soul. What connected the body to divine blessing? It was the invisible thread that joined earth to heaven. Sometimes there was no time. The baby was born and died in the midwife's arms, without crying, without sighing, without warning. And in those cases, she improvised. She invented a name. She murmured a prayer that mixed Latin with the village dialect. She placed the baby on the mother's chest and said that he had been baptized, even if she wasn't sure, because telling the truth at that moment could be devastating. For the mother, for the father, for everyone. It was better to nurture hope. It was better to believe that the soul was at peace, even if the silence said otherwise. The midwife knew it was dangerous. She knew that if she was discovered, she could be accused of usurping the office of the clergy, that she was doing something sacred without permission. But she also knew she couldn't wait. The priest might be late, you might be asleep, you might refuse to go, and the child, fragile, couldn't wait. Life was too short, and death was merciless. So she took the risk, with steady hand, eyes closed, heart pounding. She did what needed to be done, and then she kept quiet. She kept the secret between the walls of the house and the early morning breeze. To her, every baby was a seed, a promise, a spark of mystery. And losing a soul was more than a failure. It was like watching a light go out before it could shine. It was like hearing a song and not being able to remember the melody. The void that remained was not physical. It was spiritual, a silence that echoed for days. That made the midwife avoid mirrors, avoid churches, avoid her own hands, as if they had failed, as if they had allowed something to slip away, something precious, something eternal. But there were also moments when everything went right, when the baby cried, loudly, strongly, alive, and the midwife smiled, relieved, knowing that this little miracle was complete, that body and soul had met at the right time, that there would be no need to invent names or lie words, that she could rest for a few moments, certain that, at least for that night, no one would be trapped between worlds. And in those moments, she felt a rare peace, a sense that, even without a title, even without a formal blessing, she had done something sacred. Today, perhaps all this seems strange, far away, superstitious, but for those women, it was real, intensely real. The fear of eternal damnation was as real as the fear of pain. and the midwife was the only bridge, the only hope, the only voice that could, in secret, save a soul. Even if I would never receive thanks, even if I would never be remembered, even if her name would also be lost to time. At that time, people didn't talk about pleasure, they didn't talk about desire, and even less about the female body and the freedom of those who inhabit it. Knowledge about one's own womb was a field surrounded by taboos. Sexuality was covered by thick layers of sin, shame, and silence. It was as if there was a chastity belt not only on the body, but on the mind. An invisible but powerful blockage that prevented women from knowing themselves. And this affected everything, including childbirth, including the way they suffered and how they bore their own blood. Women became pregnant without knowing exactly what was happening inside them. They knew that their wombs were growing, that their breasts were hurting, that their appetites were changing, but they didn't know why. And many believed that pregnancy was a punishment for sins not committed. Some thought that the simple act of feeling pleasure was enough to invoke punishment. And when childbirth came, it was greeted with guilt, fear of being judged, fear of paying for something invisible. The body, in this context, was the enemy. It was a source of pain and shame. The midwife, on the other hand, knew more than she could say. She knew what was normal and what was not. She knew how the body responded to certain touches. She knew how to help ease pain. But she couldn't teach. She couldn't talk openly about it, because any mention of female pleasure could be misinterpreted. It could be seen as lust, as deviance, as witchcraft. So she taught with her eyes, with gentle gestures, with the right choice of words, and often with silence. A silence that said more than any explanation. There were women who spent their entire lives without understanding that their bodies could feel more than pain, that there were zones of comfort, of pleasure, of expansion. But these possibilities were locked away with the keys to the confessional. They were erased by sermons and by whispered conversations between nuns. Religion at that time shaped not only faith, but also knowledge. And knowledge about the body was dangerous, because a body that is known is a free body. And freedom, for many of those women, was just a dream whispered at dusk. Even midwives carried this burden. They had moments when they doubted themselves, when they wondered if what they knew was pure, if the instinct they followed was truly divine or the result of some deception, because they were taught to distrust what they felt. And this created a kind of knot inside them, a conflict between knowledge and duty, between touch and guilt. And yet, they continued, because they knew that knowledge, even forbidden, was necessary. It was what saved lives. It was what gave meaning to work, and what kept faith in a world where everything was controlled by fear. It is hard to imagine a world where the simple act of knowing one's own body would be a reason for punishment. But that was the case for centuries. And even today, in many corners of the world, the shadow of this mental chastity belt persists. A shadow that prevents dialogue, that creates guilt, that silences. And so, remembering these women is also an act of resistance, of recognition, of honor. They were guardians of an ancient knowledge, of a knowledge that existed long before books, that was born in the skin, in touch, in the gaze. And when they helped a woman give birth, they didn't just offer physical assistance. They offered something greater, a chance to reconnect with her own body, a breath of fresh air from her fear, a moment of clarity in the midst of pain, even if it was brief, even if it was forgotten later. In that moment, the midwife was more than a caregiver. She was a liberator. She was a whisper of wisdom in the midst of ignorance, a reminder that the body, even when repressed, could still speak. And that sometimes, all it took was to listen. The herbs did not speak with words, but they did, softly, in whispers that only a few could hear. The midwife had heard these secrets since she was a girl. She heard them when her grandmother picked sage leaves with her left hand, when her mother dried chamomile on clean cloths, away from the eyes of men, when the neighbors exchanged handfuls of leaves under the table without saying their names. It was a hidden but vivid language, a language that was not learned in books, but in the fields, and in the silence of kitchens, and in the muffled screams of childbirth. Each herb had a use, but it also had a story. Rosemary calmed the tremors of the uterus, rewarded of the evil eye. Sage cleared the air. Wormwood warmed the blood. Some made people bleed. Others kept life alive inside the womb. And it was this delicate balance that the midwife had to master. She couldn't get the dosage wrong, or the timing wrong. An infusion made too early could cause the end of a pregnancy. Another, made too late, had no effect. It was necessary to know the exact moment when the plant revealed its power. This knowledge was not explained. It was shown. It was shared with attentive eyes and patient hands. The girl who wanted to learn sat nearby, pretending to be distracted. But she paid attention to every gesture, to every touch, to every leaf that was crushed, boiled, hung. She learned with her eyes, and above all, with silence, because talking too much about herbs was dangerous. Someone might hear, someone might tell the priest, someone might accuse, and everything that was sacred became a sin. So, it was better to let the plants speak for themselves. The midwife kept her dried twigs in hidden places, high on shelves, inside dark jars, under plants embroidered with crosses, and before each birth, I chose the ones that would be used. One to ease the pain, another to ward off fear, yet another to strengthen the woman after the loss of blood. I did everything carefully, as if each mixture were a spell, and in a way, it was a spell of care, of affection, of resistance, because those leaves, simple to the eyes of many, carried centuries of wisdom. There were also herbs that could not be mentioned, used only in extreme cases, in deep secrets. They were the herbs of the limit, of difficult decisions, of the woman who could not have any more children, of the one who had already lost many, of the one who knew that her life was at risk if she became pregnant again. These herbs had no name. They were passed from mouth to mouth, in nocturnal whisper, and the midwife only used them when the silence was absolute, when the candle had already been extinguished, when the eyes were wet and the future uncertain. Today, when we think of medicine, we think of bottles, labels, and leaflets. But back then, the pharmacy was the field, the garden, the woods behind the village, and wisdom was passed down as an invisible inheritance, from generation to generation, from woman to woman. It was a living knowledge that changed over time, that adapted, that resisted, even in the face of persecution, even in the face of ignorance, even in the face of fear, because what is true always finds a way to survive. And perhaps even today, when we run our hand over a lavender branch or smell the rosemary in the wind, some ancestral memory awakened, a fragment of that ancient knowledge, a voice whispering within us, telling us that there are forces that do not need to be seen to be real, that there are cures that come from simple hands, and that, sometimes, the answer lies in the leaves, in the earth, in the touch, in the silence. In that first hour, time seemed to stand still. The baby, newly arrived into the world, should not cry too loudly, not right away. There was something in that pause that mixed superstition, fear, and reverence. The midwives knew this. They knew that the first cry was like a door opening, and that, for some, opening that door too soon could invite in that which should not enter. Some said that a hurried cry attracted bad energies. Others believed that if the baby cried too loudly, it was because he sensed something dark around him. And even without certainty, everyone respected the initial silence. The midwife, holding the baby, waited. She felt the weight, the warmth, the lightness of the still wet body. She touched the chest gently. She watched for movement, for air, and only then, gently, did she make the first sound. A light stimulation on the back, a warm breath next to the ear, a firm caress on the sole of the foot. The cry that came was not of pain. It was of presence. It was like a bell in the distance, announcing that the soul had passed on, and when the sound finally echoed through the room, everyone breathed, but still in silence, because the moment was sacred. In some villages, there were unwritten rules. The baby could not be picked up before it cried. It could not be exposed to candlelight before the blessing. It could not be touched by men before the midwife had prayed. And above all, it could not be named before its time. The name, in fact, was another delicate point. It was believed that naming too early would lock the child into this world, even if the body did not yet have the strength to stay. For this reason, many waited a day, 2, sometimes more, until they were sure that this fragile being had come to stay. The exhausted mother would ask softly if the baby was okay. The midwife would respond with gestures, with her eyes, sometimes with a simple yes, said in a whisper, because any louder word could break the spell. It was a moment of transition, like the dawn, neither day nor night, like the threshold between two worlds, and the ancients knew how to respect this. They knew that life needed silence to be born calmly, and that crying was not an announcement of pain, but of arrival, an arrival that needed to be welcomed with care. There was also fear, the fear that the crying would attract unwanted glances, that the neighbors would hear and come before time, because those who arrived did not always come for good. Sometimes they brought envy, suspicion, excessive curiosity. That is why the midwife asked that the windows remain closed, that the doors not creak, that the candle be kept low. It was as if they were hiding a fragile flame from the wind, protecting the beginning of life with layers of silence, shade, and prayer. And even when the baby was crying, there was a moment to pause, to listen, because the sound brought information. A loud cry indicated vitality. A weak cry, alert. And the midwife listened as if she were deciphering a code. as if she were reading signs of destiny. And based on that sound, she decided what to do next. The warm water, the dry cloth, the time that still needed to pass until everyone was ready for the next day. To tell the others, to give a name, to introduce the village. Because while the cry still echoed of the walls, everything remained suspended. Today, in modern hospitals, the first cry is celebrated with applause, cameras, smiles. But back then, it was a mystery, a risk, a living prayer. And perhaps even today, even with all the advances, there is something sacred in that moment. Something that cannot be measured with equipment, that cannot be explained with science. Something that belongs to the realm of the subtle, of the invisible, of what whispers between the mother's body and the child's breathing. And that, out of respect, is listened to, in silence. She didn't need to say much to cause discomfort. She just had to be there, sitting by the well, walking with a basket of herbs, touching a woman's belly with the firmness of someone who knew. And that was dangerous, because knowing too much, for a woman, was never just a virtue. It was often a threat. The midwife knew this. She knew every gesture she could make, and every word to swallow. Her knowledge came from blood, from touch, from repetition. It wasn't theoretical knowledge. It was ancestral, intuitive, alive. But too alive for many people's taste. She knew when a pregnancy was recent, even before her belly grew. She knew the difference between normal pain and the pain that heralded tragedy. She knew which herbs eased it and which stopped it. And this knowledge put her in an ambiguous position. She was revered and feared. She was sought after in secret and avoided in public. Some men said she was just an old hand. Others whispered that she did too much to be just that. That her hands were too skillful. That her eyes saw too much. And so they should be watched. There were priests who wouldn't look her in the eye. They preferred to send messages, veiled warnings about the limits of knowledge. But she already knew these signs. She had seen them before, with other women. With those who were taken in for questioning, with those who disappeared after rumors spread, with those who were called witches because they knew their bodies better than their own husband. And she learned to move carefully, like someone walking through a minefield. Every choice, every gesture, every silence was also a form of protection. Still, her knowledge could not be contained, because it was needed. It saved. When the village slept, she was the one who was called. When the fever rose, when the blood wouldn't stop, when the child wouldn't breathe, she was the one who knew what to do. And no one questioned, in those moments, where this knowledge came from. No one asked if it was sacred or profane. They just trusted. They just gave their bodies, their children, their hopes. And she accepted, even knowing that, come dawn, she could once again be viewed with suspicion. The midwife who knew too much was also lonely. There were few people with whom she could share this burden, with whom she could speak openly, with whom she could tell of her losses, her scares, her miracle. Most people just wanted the result. The baby in their arms, the woman alive, and then oblivion. But she did not forget. She carried in her memory every face, every moan, every look of terror. And this transformed her, slowly, silently, like water that carves away stone. It made her denser, more introspective, more attentive to what people say with their eyes. She also knew how to recognize hypocrisy. She knew that those who criticized her were the same ones who came knocking on her door in the dead of night. That those who accused her of witchcraft were the same ones who begged for her help when her wife bled too much. And she, no matter how much she knew, did not refuse, because her knowledge was greater than her hurt, greater than her pride. It was a knowledge that had come from generation, and that could not be kept to herself. It was a service, a calling, a silent vow made at moonrise. And so she continued, day after day, in the middle of the village, in the middle of the forest, in the middle of the night, with eyes that saw more than they should, and hands that did more than they could. She was the midwife who knew too much, and for that reason, she was also the woman who carried the world within her. A world made of births, deaths, and whispered prayers. A world where knowledge was not displayed, but lived and protected, as if it were a flame that, if exposed too much, could go out. It wasn't just the body that was torn during childbirth. There were other, more subtle tissues that were also torn. Tears, bonds, silences. And sometimes you could even hear a dry, muffled sound, like cloth being torn. It was the moment when life demanded entry, without asking permission. The sound came from within, from the body, yes, but also from the soul. And those who were there nearby knew that something was being broken forever, that nothing would ever be the same again. That woman, that daughter, that mother, was crossing an invisible boundary. And that sound remained, even after the silence, even after the child was born. Older mothers recognized that sound. They had heard it inside themselves. years before, and when they saw their daughters going through it, they closed their eyes, not out of weakness, but out of memory. They knew what was coming. They knew the pain that has no name, and they knew that, afterward, they would have to sew it back together, not just the flesh, but what had been torn inside the heart. Because childbirth didn't just separate the mother from the child, it also separated the woman who existed before from the one who would come after. And that gap, that abyss between the two, was often lonely. The midwife knew that sound better than anyone. I had heard it in dozens of houses, on stormy nights, on cold mornings, in stone rooms, in huts. Each tear was different, sometimes abrupt, sometimes slow, like ancient fabric slowly giving way. And she didn't run. She didn't scream. She just took deep breaths and did what needed to be done. She touched gently. She controlled the blood. She whispered words she had learned from women who had gone before. And she waited. She waited for the pain to ease, for life to reorganize around the wound. But the tear was not always in the body. There were births where everything went well, without blood, without screams, without complications. And yet, at the end, the woman's gaze said it all. Something had been broken. A bond, a memory, a promise, and the midwife understood. She sat beside her, in silence. She offered water. She touched her hand tenderly, because there were no words for that kind of pain. It was an ancestral pain, inherited, passed down like an old dress from generation to generation, and that, sooner or later, needed to be felt. The sound of the tearing cloth also appeared in stories, in the village legends, in the songs sung by women as they sewed. It was a symbol, a metaphor, a warning. It was said that after giving birth, women should rest next to soft fabrics, that they should sew something with their own hands, to remind them that what is torn can also be remade. Not the same, never the same, but new, and that the pain of the tear can become thread, can become a ribbon, can become an inheritance, if it is cared for with patience and care. There were mothers who, after giving birth, distanced themselves from their own mothers, not out of anger, but because something had changed. The previous bond no longer made sense. A new path was needed, a new way of finding each other, and that hurt, like a fabric that no longer fits. But it also freed. It gave space for each one to find their place in the new landscape of life. And over time, they learned to look at each other again, with different eyes, with different hands, with different silences, more mature, slower, more compassionate. Today, few people talk about this sound, about this invisible tear, but it keeps happening. In hospitals, in homes, in dark or bright rooms. Every time a life is born, something breaks. And every time something breaks, there is a chance to sew it back together, to rebuild it, to find beauty in the seams, in the marks, in the scraps. Because life is not made of perfect fabric, but of pieces sewn together with love, with courage, and with the silent wisdom of those who know that tearing, sometimes, is the first step towards rebirth. It was a cold morning when this happened. The midwife knew something was wrong. The woman's sweat was freezing. Her eyes were growing distant. Her breathing was fluctuating between strength and absence. And yet, she continued, there was no choice. The baby still needed to be born. It was like trying to save a flame while the wind was already blowing too hard. The midwife said nothing. Her hands were calm. But inside, time was slipping away, as if the world's clock had stopped in that bed. Between the body that was emptying and the other that was starting to breathe, the baby was born in a silence that seemed bigger than the room itself. Yes, he cried, a faint, hesitant cry. But no one responded with joy. The woman, pale, did not move. Her arms no longer waited. Her gaze no longer searched. The midwife wrapped the child in warm cloths. She rested his head against his mother's chest for a moment, as if listening for the last time. And then she covered the body with the care one shows the living. Because respecting death is a way of continuing to care, even when everything is gone. Outside, the village was asleep. No sound, no candles lit, no souls keeping watch. And inside, two opposing presences shared the same space. The absence of the mother and the insistent presence of the child. It was a scene that called for no words, only loud eyes, steady hands, hearts that endured. The midwife sat for a few minutes, just watching. She felt the warmth of the baby in her arms, and the cold coming from the bed. It was like holding the beginning and the end of the world, one in each arm, and trying to understand what to do with it. It wasn't the first time this had happened, but it was never the same. Each mother who left something different, an unspoken name, an interrupted gesture, a broken promise, and each baby that lived brought new questions. How to tell the truth, how to talk about a mother who could only exist for a few hours, how to care for such a small being in the face of such a great absence. The midwife didn't know all the answers, but she knew how to wrap the baby up, how to calm the crying, how to whisper a song that said everything without saying anything. Later, when the village woke up, someone would come, someone who would call the mother's name, who would ask how it was, and the midwife would answer calmly, without dramatizing, without hiding, only with the delicate truth of someone who has seen a lot, of someone who understands that sometimes life insists on blossoming in the midst of mourning, that love can begin at the same moment that pain begins, and that the silence of that early morning would be remembered forever, not as a trauma, but as a portal, a moment where the sacred touched the earth. And the baby, he would grow up listening to stories, some told, others kept quiet. He would grow in the arms of other women. He would be fed with milk and memories, with touch and mystery, and perhaps one day he would understand that his arrival cost a goodbye, that his first breath coincided with the last sigh of someone who loved him without knowing him, and that, far from being a burden, could be strength, a rare kind of strength, that which is born of silent love, of involuntary sacrifice, of that which will never be forgotten. Even today, there are dawns like that, in hospitals, in villages, in shacks, dawns in which life and death meet without warning, and in which midwives, with or without a degree, have to make decisions that cannot be written in books. They have to embrace two worlds with the same pair of hands, and move on, because in the end, the journey continues, and the silence of that dawn, it continues to echo, like an ancient song, like a breath of gratitude and mourning intertwined in the air. It was always like that. When the village went to sleep, she got up, not because she wanted to, but because she was called. A sound at the door, a whisper through the cracks, the hurried tapping of bare feet on the dirt path. Someone needed her, and she went. It didn't matter what time it was, or how cold it was, or how tired she was. While everyone slept, she walked through the empty streets, carrying in her hands what no one saw, courage and silence, because that was what a midwife carried at night. There was no lantern, there was no protection, just firm steps and a mission that was born in the village fell asleep early. The lights were dim, there was no noise, but she knew that not every night was a night of rest. In some houses, pain woke up before daylight, a low moan, an unexpected bleed, a baby that came unexpectedly, and in those moments, she was the only one who moved. She passed through the houses like a familiar figure, a figure that brought hope and fear at the same time, because her presence meant that something was about to happen, and no one called the midwife without a reason. She got used to the silence. She learned to listen to the sound of her own footsteps, to perceive the smell of the fog, to distinguish the sound of the wind from the sigh of dawn. Time didn't pass for her as it did for others. It stretched out, between one contraction and another, between one life and another. The night, for her, was a place of work, of listening, of prison. While others dreamed, she held hands, wiped foreheads, whispered prayers that soothed more than any medicine, and when the baby's cry finally echoed, it was as if she were breathing for the first time too. There were no promises of rest. There were no Sundays. There were no holidays. Her job did not recognize calendars. It was a calling that crossed season, that ignored the body's time. And yet, she kept going, because she knew that no one else could do what she did, because she knew that if it weren't for her, many mothers would be alone, many lives would be lost. And this knowledge was at once a burden and a reason to keep going. It was what made her get out of bed without complaining, what made her put on her shoes without hesitation, what made her resist sleep. Some mornings, she would come home with cold hands, her eyes heavy, the smell of blood still in her hair. She would sit for a moment before going to bed. She would look out the window at the dark sky, and she would think about the woman she had just left, about the baby who was now sleeping, about the candle that was still lit in the room. She knew that the house was resting because of her, and that gave her peace, a different kind of peace, not of rest, but of a mission accomplished, a peace that came from serving, from giving, from being there when no one else was. No one in the village asked about her nights. They rarely thanked her. They rarely remembered her, because her presence was almost invisible. It was part of the landscape, like the sound of the mill, like the smell of firewood, like the rooster crowing. But she knew that her absence would be missed. She knew that, even in the silence, she was seen, that, even without words, she was expected, and that was enough. She didn't do it for glory, or for recognition. She did it because it was necessary, and because there was something in her that responded to the pain of others with her own body. When the village slept, less her, always less her, and it was in this less that her greatness existed, a greatness that is not measured in medals, but in sighs of relief, in lives saved, in tears dried, in sheets folded at dawn, a greatness that hides in the darkness, but that shines, for those who know how to look, like a solitary star in the... She knew she could not make a mistake, even when everything around her was uncertain. Even when the birth was sideways, when the baby did not cry, when the woman screamed more than expected. She knew that any failure would fall on her, and not only as criticism, but as guilt. A guilt that was not said out loud, but insinuated itself in looks, in silences, in distances that grew after the events. If something went wrong, they said it was because she did too much, or too little, because she used the wrong herb, or because she prayed too little. There was always something in her conduct that could be questioned, and that weighed. It weighed like a stone on the soul. When everything went well, the credit went to God, to destiny, to luck, to the strong blood of the family. But when something went wrong, the midwife became a target, even if she had done everything right, even if she had given her entire life to that moment, even if she had gotten out of bed on a cold night, walked through dark streets, used everything she knew to save the mother and child. The recognition was silent, the criticism not. And over time, she learned to carry this weight without complaining, like someone who accepts a cross that no one sees. The guilt came in subtle forms, a whisper at the market, a sudden departure, a thank you that never came, a candle that was lit for the priest, but not for her. And she noticed, but she said nothing. She kept everything, like she kept the stories, like she kept the names of those she helped to give birth, like she kept the hands of the mothers she held during contractions. The guilt accumulated over time, not as resentment, but as a shadow that followed her, even on sunny days. There were nights when she wondered if she could have done things differently, if she had arrived sooner, if I had used a different infusion, if I had sung softer. These were doubts that gnawed at her insides, that weighed on her shoulders, that hid behind her tired eyes, and that no one saw, because everyone thought she was strong, that she was used to it, that she did it effortlessly. But they didn't know what she was giving up, what she felt, how much she carried in silence, like someone carrying on their back a suitcase full of names that have never been said. The midwife was both guardian and defendant, protector and suspect. She could not defend herself without appearing guilty. She could not get emotional without appearing weak. She had to maintain her balance, and that made her even more alone. Few women understood, few men cared, and the church, almost always, preferred not to see. Medicine at that time was not for them, and true care was not recognized as knowledge. That is why she remained invisible, a forced invisibility. That guaranteed her the freedom to continue, and the pain of never being fully accepted. Even so, she did not give up, because she knew that, despite her guilt, her presence was essential. She knew that without her, the fear would be greater, that the risk would be crueler, that the loneliness would be unbearable. And so, she continued, with firm steps, with attentive eyes, with hands that had already been accused, but that still knew how to touch with tenderness. It was her way of resisting, of healing, of existing, of transforming each guilt into care, each silence into prison, each judgment into compassion. And who knows today, when we look back, we can see these women as they really were, not as shadows of history, but as invisible pillars, as voices that whispered life in times of death, as guardians of a knowledge that has spent centuries, even covered in guilt. Because what they carried cannot be erased. It continues to echo, in every birth, in every care, in every gesture of those who, even without knowing it, follow in their footsteps. In those days, the body was read as if it were a map, and among all the possible signs, the feet held secret. For many, a woman's feet said more than her words. There were those who believed that by observing her heels, it was possible to know if she was fertile, if her births would be easy or difficult, if her body would be able to withstand the pains that would come. It wasn't science, it was tradition, empirical wisdom, passed down by women who learned to observe the world with attentive eyes, and the midwife was one of those readers. She knew that every detail counted, and the feet, small, calloused, cracked, spoke. They carried the weight of many paths, paths between houses, paths between prayers, paths between losses and hopes. A woman's feet told how many times she had given birth, how many times she had cried in silence, how many nights she had walked inside herself, without moving. There were marks that time had left, a swelling that would not go away, a walk that revealed more than the face could hide. And the midwife, with her silent experience, read all of this. She did not judge. She simply understood, because that was how one learned in that world, by seeing what no one else saw. The feet also spoke of origins, where the woman came from, if she was a peasant, if she was a lady, if she had worked too hard before giving birth, or if she had had some rest, the texture of the skin, The cuts, the nails, the calluses, all of this told a story. It wasn't about vanity, it was about life, about how much that body had endured even before the child arrived. And when the woman lay down to give birth, her feet were exposed, almost always uncovered, almost always forgotten. But the midwife observed them, like someone reading a preface before the book. There were specific beliefs. They said that white feet indicated ease in giving birth. The clubfoot heralded complicated births. That the warmth of the feet could predict the exact time of birth. The midwife, even if she didn't say it out loud, noted these signs within herself. She knew when the body was ready, and when it wasn't. And in those moments, she used this subtle knowledge to decide what to do. A slower massage, a longer pause between contractions, a warm cloth placed carefully, as if honoring a part of the body that almost no one remembered. Some women, after giving birth, would immediately cover their feet, as if they wanted to hide the marks left by the journey, as if they wanted to protect what was left. Others would leave them in the open without fear, as if to say, I survived. And the midwife understood both gestures. I knew that everyone deals with pain in a different way, that some people need to hide it in order to heal, and others need to show it in order to move on. And there was no right or wrong in that, just different ways of continuing to live. Today, almost no one talks about feet. They are cared for aesthetically, treated in salons, covered by shoes. But back then, they were signs, roadmaps, living relics of everything a woman had walked. And even without words, they continue to tell stories. Stories that modern medicine may ignore, but that ancient wisdom still listens to. In silence, with respect, with reverence. And who knows, when we look at our own feet today, we might find something that we have forgotten. A trace of the strength that brought us here. A vestige of the journey of those who came before. A reminder that the body speaks. It has always spoken, even when the world chose not to listen. They didn't look at each other often, but they crossed paths, always from a distance. The midwife and the gravedigger, she present at the beginning, he at the end. Two sides of the same path, two silent jobs, invisible until the moment they were called upon. When everyone cried, he was the one who dug. When everyone prayed, she was the one who supported. And although they seemed opposites, their destinies were intertwined. Because many times, a birth ended in burial. And many times, a wake reopened the wounds of a difficult birth. She brought the world. He returned it to the earth. They both knew what others avoided knowing. The smell of blood, the weight of the body, the fading temperature. They knew the urgency of time that does not forgive, of families that do not understand, and also of the silence, a silence that accompanied each gesture, each movement, because both in birth and in death, there was not much to say. There was something to do, and they did it. A clean cloth, a shallow grave, a light touch, a shovel of lime, and then the return to the shadows, to anonymity, to the solitude of those who deal with mystery every day. It wasn't common for them to talk, but there was a mutual recognition, a silent respect. If the midwife passed by the cemetery, she would lower her eyes. If the gravedigger passed her on the road, he would adjust his hat. It was as if they both carried a secret language, the language of limits, of what begins and what ends, of what no one wants to see, but which moves the world. And there were days when he needed her, and days when she needed him. And even without saying it, they understood, because they knew that their presence maintained the order of things. Sometimes the same night required both. A mother died, a baby was born, or vice versa. She left the house carrying life, he entered carrying death, and between these moments, there was a space too small for logic, an interval in which everything seemed absurd, cruel, but also sacred, because there was no way to completely separate the two. Those who deal with births know that death lurks, those who bury know that life insists. And between these margins, the midwife and the gravedigger walked, with firm steps, with worn eye, with calloused heart. She knew the names of the babies who were not left behind. He knew where they were buried. Sometimes he would pass by in silence, not as someone who visits, but as someone who recognizes, because each loss was also his. Each absence left a mark. The gravedigger, in turn, had already buried bodies that she had helped to give birth to, and he knew that time is short, that the cycle has no pause, that, in the end, everything returns, and that his work was not only with the earth, it was with memory, with dignity, with the last care. Perhaps if they had been from another time, they would have been friends. They would have exchanged stories. They would have talked about the sounds of the early morning, about the eyes that never close, about the sounds that stay on your skin. But there, at that time, they were just neighbors by trade, involuntary partners. One would start what the other would finish. And yet, there was affection, There was something poetic in that absence of words, as if they were saying, with just their gestures, I understand you. I also carry the world on my shoulders. And today, as we remember these figures, perhaps we can honor what they did, not with applause, but with silence, with respect, with gratitude. Because without them, life and death would be even more lonely, even colder, even more forgotten. Not everything was said out loud. There were words that didn't belong to men, or priests, or books. They were women's words, words that were born in the midst of pain, fear, sweat, words that weren't in prayers, but that had the same power. The midwife knew them all. Some were short, some were long, some were made up on the spot. Others were inherited from grandmothers. They were like spells, like blessings in disguise. They only made sense in that context, in that house, that night, and then they disappeared like vapor. The contractions came, and with them, the language changed. The woman stopped speaking as she always did. She began to murmur old words, from childhood, from prayers, from fear. The pain gave rise to a new, raw, intimate language, and the midwife responded in the same tone. She used nicknames, diminutives, expressions that only made sense between women, words that comforted, that distracted, that gave strength. It was a conversation without grammar, but full of meaning. A linguistic ritual where each syllable was also taken care of. There were also forbidden words, those that could not be said in front of men, those that spoke of the body, of blood. And so they created their own codes, a false name for the placenta, a nickname for the cut, a metaphor for pain. It was a way of protecting themselves, of keeping their knowledge a secret, of escaping the judgmental eyes, because what was said between them was sacred. It was affection, it was survival, and no one had the right to take that away from them. During labor, words gained a different speed, sometimes slow as a prayer, sometimes fast as a scream, and the midwife knew when to shut up. She knew that there are pains that call for silence, that there are times when a hand is worth more than any sentence, but she also knew when to speak, when to repeat an old phrase that always worked, when to remember the name of that woman's mother, when to invoke the strength of those who came before, because at that moment, everything she said was like a rope thrown into the bottom of a well. Words were also a legacy, passed from midwife to midwife, from grandmother to granddaughter, from neighbor to neighbor. Some didn't even know the exact meaning, but they knew how and when to use them, and that was enough. Because more than meaning, those words carried intention. They were arrows shot against fear. They were cloaks thrown over pain. They were bridges built between generations. And even if no one else used them outside of them, they continued to live within those walls, within those voices. Today, perhaps no one speaks like that anymore. Perhaps those words have been lost over time. Perhaps they are dormant in some corner of the language. But who knows, when a woman goes into labor and someone holds her hand and says something simple, something ancient, something that no one teaches, there is a trace of those words, an echo of that secret language, a trace of what only they said. And perhaps upon hearing this, the baby will feel it, even without understanding, even without knowing how to speak. Because there are words that go through the skin, that touch the soul, that say, you are safe, you are being waited for, you are being loved. Before the word came the touch, always the touch. That was how it all began. A hand on the forehead, a damp cloth on the belly, a finger pressing on the pulse. The midwife didn't need to announce her presence. She just had to touch. And suddenly, the woman in pain was no longer alone. There was someone there, someone who knew, someone who understood, and most of all, someone who would stay until the end. The midwife's touch was not just technical. It was ancestral. It was transmitted with the same care as a lit candle, without haste, without fuss, but with the certainty that it saves. It was a touch that didn't ask, that didn't demand, that simply offered itself. And that was enough. In those moments when the contraction came like an overwhelming wave, it was that touch that anchored, that reminded, you are here, you are alive, you are capable. It didn't matter how old the woman was, or how many children she had already had. The fear always returned, and it was always the touch that soothed, like a silent reminder that pain has a form, and that it also has an end. The midwife touched with intention, not in a hurry. She touched with respect, as if asking permission from the body, as if acknowledging the story that the womb holds. And the body responded, even tired, even hurt. It responded with a sigh, with a tremor, with a surrender that cannot be explained, because the body knew. It knew how to distinguish a touch of judgment from a touch of care, and it opened itself. It let itself be guided. It let itself be reminded of everything it was capable of. Sometimes the touch came before the words. When the woman arrived with tears in her eyes, when there was too much silence between one contraction and the next, when fear took over the room. At these times, the midwife would hold the hand. She would squeeze it firmly, as if to say, I'm here. I'm not leaving. You're not going to get through this alone. And this simple gesture, repeated so many times over the centuries, was like a thread that connected all the women in the world. A thread that said, together, even in pain. And it wasn't just during the birth. It was also afterwards, when everything was over. When the baby was already in my arms. When the crying turned into silence. The touch continued. A caress of the hair. A light massage of the feet. A warm cloth on the back. Gestures that said, you did it. You survived. And now, you deserve rest. You deserve to be welcome. You deserve love, even if the world doesn't tell you, even if no one notices. I noticed. Today, perhaps touch has been replaced by devices, by protocols, by necessary distance. But it still exists. It still pulses. In the hands that hold, that embrace, that soothe. Because there are things that do not change, that time does not erase, that modernity does not overcome. And one of them is this touch, that does not cure everything, but that sustains, that does not resolve, but that accompanies, that does not promise, but that remains. And maybe, one day, in some moment of fragility, someone will hold your hand in the same way, and you, without really understanding why, will feel that you are home, that you are safe, that you are being seen. And then, maybe you will remember, even without knowing where from, that this touch is centuries old, that it has crossed dawns, villages, fields, seas, that it comes from far away, and that, like all sacred things, it does not need an explanation, only present. If you've stuck around this far, maybe you've felt it too. Perhaps you heard the sound of forgotten voices, the whisper of tired hands, the heavy silence of those who never stopped caring, even when no one cared for them. Perhaps for a moment, you lay on that stone floor, surrounded by prayers and hope. You smelled the smoke and herbs, the taste of fear in your mouth, the waiting, the courage, the touch. And if you felt it, know this, there are many other stories like this one, hidden in the corners of history, just waiting for someone who wants to hear them, with their eyes closed if you want, or with an open heart. When night comes again, I will be here, as I have always been, with one more thread of memory, with one more candle lit, whispering the past, until sleep comes. Good night.